Hello and welcome to another session of Groundbreakers Live. I'm your host Javed Mohammed, and I'm very honored to have with us Ahmed Alomari, who is an Oracle ace and a performance specialist at Cybernoor. Ahmed, welcome.
Thank you, Javed. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so it's the first time we're meeting, and you are part of the APAC Groundbreakers 2020 tour. I'm just kind of curious, is this your first time, and how just how is your experience so far?
Yeah, this will be my first time presenting
Uh-huh.
at it.
Uh-huh.
So looking forward to it. It's, of course, this year virtual event. So
Uh-huh.
looking forward to it.
So it makes it a little more challenging, but
Right.
yeah, okay. So you have your talk there is immediate relief, fix the SQL now. So give us a top level overview. What's the talk about, the presentation
Yeah,
about?
sure. So one of the challenges typically in the performance space when as people are managing systems such as database administrators or application administrators is there might be from time to time performance issues involving specific SQL statements,
Mm-hmm.
and those SQL statements might be a generic a standard product or from packaged applications,
Mm-hmm.
such as eBusiness Suite or PeopleSoft or SAP or whichever third-party app might be running. In some cases, there may be custom code, for extensions that the customer developed, and sometimes it becomes a challenge of, okay, how do I tune the SQL, for example, because I don't have access to the source code, and so I'm not able to change the SQL statement itself. And so the talk is really about how to deal with that situation and what tools and techniques does Oracle provide in order to improve the performance of a SQL statement without having to actually change the code, using techniques, for example, such as creating SQL profiles or SQL patches to improve the SQL statement. For example, you want to um, switch a particular execution plan that is just more efficient based on the data sets and based on how the application is being used.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't have the luxury of inserting hints because you don't have the luxury of changing the actual application code. So by using these tools that Oracle provides, that allows an opportunity to essentially to improve performance and get relief to the users without having to actually change the application code.
Okay. So I just want to just pause there a little bit. So the first question that kind of comes to my mind is, so when you're talking about performance issues, is that something that you just kind of sense, or is there some specific tools you run periodically from a maintenance standpoint that would indicate that there is a performance issue, or users report it in, or how does that work?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So it could come from multiple avenues. For example, the customers might be using Enterprise Manager to monitor the environment, and they may have, for example, alerts, or using, for example, the dashboard. They might see, for example, a top SQL consuming a lot of resources, maybe consuming a lot of CPU, or consuming a lot of or performing a lot of disk I/O, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That might be one avenue. Or they might see the SQL statement, for example, just taking a long time, like the elapsed time is very long and might be causing the user request to time out from the application perspective. That's
Mm-hmm.
typically one avenue. So the administrator himself kind of identified and spotted that SQL as a performance bottleneck just by monitoring using maybe, for example, Enterprise Manager
Mm-hmm.
or maybe some other tools. And then the other avenue might be the users themselves are complaining that the performance is slow, and they might have, for example, logged a help desk ticket or logged in an application support ticket, for example, to say my screen is either hanging or not coming back, or it's just running slow, for example. And then that might trigger some additional analysis. And then when the administrator kind of drills down and says, okay, the root cause of this performance issue is due to this SQL statement or a group of SQL statements.
Okay. So then what's the next step? So once they've identified the quote unquote bad SQL, what happens next?
Yeah, sure. So typically what you would do is, review the execution plan of that SQL statement and
Mm-hmm.
see what execution plan the, optimizer has assigned to it. For example, is it doing, some full table scans? If it's using indexes, which indexes are being used?
Mm-hmm.
Or for example, the SQL statement itself might have had hints, and those hints are actually causing a suboptimal plan, and the default optimizer plan that Oracle generated is more efficient. And since you don't have access to the application code to remove those hints or comment them out, you're essentially stuck with that plan. So once you kind of review the execution plan and determine that, okay, I found a more efficient optimal plan that can replace the current plan that's being used, then you can use, for example, create a SQL profile to change that statement to use the alternate execution plan that's more efficient, or for example, ignore the hints that the application is so that the default optimizer plan will be used. And there are various mechanisms to do that. So for example, if you use the SQL tuning advisor, that's integrated as a plugin with the Oracle Enterprise Manager, what it'll do is it'll actually take that SQL statement, for example, and by using dynamic sampling, it'll go and determine if there are more efficient execution plans than the one currently being used. And then what it'll do is it'll give you, it'll present you with those plan options, and it'll actually compare them. There's another feature called SPA, which is the SQL Performance Analyzer. And what it can do is actually compare the performance of those alternate plans. So for example, it'll say your current SQL statement is averaging maybe 60 seconds or 2 minutes, for example. And if you use plan A, it'll reduce it to 1 second. If you use plan B, it'll reduce it to less than a second, maybe sub-seconds. And then it'll allows you to compare the plans. So it kind of shows a diff, and then it presents you an option to, do you want to accept that plan? And then if you accept that plan, then it'll create a profile, and then the next time that SQL statement is executed, it'll switch to using that alternate plan. So the key really is, after identifying, typically, in my experience, identifying the top SQL is, usually doesn't take a lot of time. That's usually the most trivial part of the whole, performance life cycle. Because there's a lot of great tools out there that allow you to identify what SQLs are expensive and consuming resources, but the really challenge is to find ways to optimize that SQL to make it run more efficiently, and that's where essentially these tools and other options come in play. So typically you'll go through that discovery phase, which is to identify the SQLs, and that typically doesn't take a lot of time. The next phase will be the analysis phase of, okay, analyzing the SQL, what can be done to make it more efficient, either through a plan or a SQL rewrite, or some additional indexes, or combination of all those things, or maybe tweaking the execution plan to be more efficient, and then implementing that analysis essentially to bring relief to the users.
And how long is kind of the turnaround for doing this analysis and then the actual execution and the implementation? I mean, I know obviously it's probably very case dependent, but what are we talking about?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So depending on the, of course, on the complexity of the SQL statement, if the SQL statement is very simple, for example, maybe, a few table joins or something like that, then these tools, the SQL Tuning Advisor, and the SQL Performance Analyzer can, within minutes, generate some good alternatives and good recommendations. And then you would probably need, maybe another 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or 30 minutes to kind of analyze and compare the metrics and just make sure that that plan is good, for all the cases, to accept that. But for more complex SQLs where, sometimes the SQL statement might be some kind of data analytics SQL or reporting SQL where it might have, 50 joins or 100 joins, just because of its referencing a lot of views. Those views are being joined to other views. And depending on that complexity, that might take, more time because there's a lot more, deep dives and analysis that needs to be done.
Okay. All right. So one last question. So I know you mentioned at the outset, like, people, there's different ways that this can go about. And one of the ways is that users are experiencing poor performance and everything. Are there like any best practices of, periodically people, just like from a maintenance standpoint, to run some of these sequences that you've and the tools that you've mentioned to do that periodically, or it's just more kind of a reactive thing?
Yeah, sure. No, great question. No, definitely the recommendation is, to be as proactive as possible. And typically what you would do is, you would have, if the customer is using Enterprise Manager, we typically recommend, for example, creating a lot of monitoring, alerts. And there's a lot of course, default alerts that are out of the box that kind of, identify these things. And in addition to that, we would recommend that the, customer capture what's called a baseline, not to be confused with the SQL plan baseline feature, but just a baseline of the system itself, which would kind of snapshot the, types of load on the system. For example, you might be seeing, 10,000 IOPS, on a daily basis, typically as an average. And then, so you would kind of monitor for that. And then the alerts could basically identify the, abnormalities when it gets outside that norm. So all of a sudden, if your system normally runs at 10,000 IOPS, for example. And these class of SQLs, for example, take, this amount of time. All of a sudden, if it goes to 100,000 IOPS, then you can, identify those irregularities and try to drill down and see, okay, what happened? Did the execution plans for those common set of SQLs change, or is it additional load that came on, or maybe more volume being processed? But typically you would want to be proactive is, establish some form of baseline metrics that encompasses the types of utilization of your, production system, and then look for the outliers and, things that can change. And then also within Enterprise Manager, there's a lot of great ability to, if you have, for example, what we typically call, some hot SQLs, meaning that these are the set of SQLs that represent the core of your application. And it's very important that those, SQL statements or PL/SQL calls have a consistent set of, performance. So for example, if you know that one SQL is, executed millions of times a day, and it always does, 100 buffer gets, or, always should complete in, 1 millisecond or less, then you can basically have all that monitoring and alerting around that, so that if there's any, for example, plan changes that cause the performance to go south, you can immediately identify those proactively versus, waiting for a user to report bad application performance.
Okay. So Ahmed, this sounds like a really exciting presentation. I encourage the viewers out there to actually check it out. So thanks for giving us your time, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.